Well, hello, I'm Matt, and today I'm going to be painting up a chibi miniature from the Super Dungeon Explorer core box. It's going to be the Royal Paladin, and with each of the hero models in this set, I have challenged myself to try out a technique that I may be less than proficient on. And today, since the Royal Paladin is clad in silver armor, it's going to be non-metallic metal. Let's get started. You might be noticing that I started painting without priming the model with spray primer first. This was a decision I made because I noticed that the plastic actually holds the paint pretty well without a primer, and also because the plastic details are fairly shallow, and I felt like a couple extra layers of paint might obscure more detail than I'd like. So I felt comfortable painting directly onto the model. However, when the whole paint job was done, I made sure to coat the model with a matte varnish to protect the paint job that I had just spent a few hours on. I chose to use the artwork from the card as reference material and inspiration for the paint job. You can pick any reference you like, though I recommend not using another miniature as reference because you're trying to evoke either a fantasy or real image and not a figure, and it helps to feel like you're not duplicating someone else's miniature paint job. Of course, you don't have to paint your model exactly like the picture either, nor do you only have to pick one image for inspiration. You can go as bold as you like with the colors. I chose to stick to the colors chosen by the game designers because I felt the predominantly blue costume was a good fit for the Player 1 protagonist character. I started by adding some Citadel Eshin Gray to my makeshift wet palette. I then used it to base coat pretty much all of the metal parts on the figure. This includes the armor, the shield, and the blade of the sword. Eshin Gray is a dark gray with a hint of blue that's a perfect complement to the blue cloak that we're going to be painting. However, Eshin Gray is not a metallic paint. Because our hero is emulating a chibi anime art style, I chose to try my hand at non-metallic metal, since real 2D artwork doesn't use any metallic colors, and instead tricks your eye with sharper shifts in color to emulate the shiny reflections. I'm fairly new to painting non-metallic metal, so this model was a great opportunity to practice it. I then base coated all of the cloth on the cloak and the waistcloth with Teslas Blue, a fairly medium shade of bright blue that I would shade down later. Next up, I coated the hair with Trollslayer Orange, which is a nice bright orange that serves both to shade the hair and to support the yellow highlights later on, since yellows are really difficult to paint consistently without a bright color underneath. Then I base coated all of the skin with Kislev Flesh. Since the face is the most important part of the model, I wanted to avoid too many layers of thick paint obscuring the details, so I thinned it down first with a bit of water on the wet palette before applying it. With the base coat finished, I went to shading the cloak with some Dollar Rowney FW Indigo acrylic ink, thinned down about halfway with water. These inks are really strong in pigment, so I always make sure to cut them in half with water first. The indigo ink applied over 2 coats on the Teslas Blue produced a nice strong royal blue tone. Between coats, I actually dabbed the ink around on the armor as well to darken it up a bit and add a hint of the blue as though it were reflective metal picking up on the blue from the cloth. Next, I washed all of the flesh and the bottom of the hair with Dollar Rowney Burnt Umber ink, mixed with half of the Kislev Flesh and then thinned down a bit with water. While waiting for that to dry, I coated the face of the shield with Teslas Blue and painted the hilt of the sword with Steel Legion Drab, which will serve as the base coat for the gold coloring later on. Now, with the washes done, it's time for some layering. I started with the face by adding thin layers building up from the mix of wash and Kislev flesh up to pure Kislev flesh, leaving a very thin ring around each eye where the wash was. This will help to naturally accent the eyes when we paint them. I also built up the color slightly away from the hairline just for the same reason, and left the underside of the chin a bit darker for the shadow. Next up was the challenging part, working on the eyes. I decided to base coat the entire eye with Ultawan Gray. This is a white with a touch of bluish gray in it. I try not to use pure white or black because they tend to look unnaturally bright or dark. I have to be careful when applying this color because I don't want the white to accidentally bleed into the washed area. While waiting for that to dry, I coated the mouth area with Rhinox hide, which is a very dark brown that nicely washes the red that we're going to use for the tongue. I also used this color on the upper eyelashes area, being careful not to let it drip into the white of the eyes. I chose to make the eyes a slightly different shade of blue than the rest of the model, using Sotek Green for the iris, which is a very dark turquoise. When painting chibi eyes, it's helpful to have some good images for reference. I've found it's best to work the color from the top and the inner edge of the eye outward, leaving a thin crescent of white curving from the outer to the bottom part of the eye. The white part has to be just the perfect size, because if it's too big, the character will look cross-eyed or angry, but if there isn't enough white, then they'll look bug-eyed or dreamy-eyed. Then I used a slightly lighter shade to add an arc of highlight to the iris with Temple Guard Blue. This arc goes around the bottom and the outside of the iris, but not around the inner or upper portion. Then I added the dots of the pupils with Rhinox hide to finish them off. I like to use a contrasting color for the pupils rather than flat black, so if the irises are blue, purple, or red, I'll use a dark brown for the pupils. But if the irises are green, yellow, or orange, I'll use a very dark purple to give the effect of black without actually having to use it. The size of the pupil is also important to determining the character's expression. The smaller the pupil, the more the character will look angry or crazed. The larger the pupil, the more dreamy-eyed or cutesy they will look. The last detail that's fairly specific to anime art is a dot of light reflection to imply the glossy surface of the eye. For this, I used a dot of Ultawan Gray, slightly to the side of the pupil on the same side on both eyes, not mirroring it since the light would be reflecting off at the same angle for both eyes. From here, it was all highlights and details. I started by highlighting up the flesh by adding a tiny bit of Ultawan Gray and even a little bit of Emperor's Children Pink to the Kislev flesh tone to lighten it up and add a little bit of warmth. I only used this on the bridge of the nose and the upper part of the cheeks to add some natural highlight. For the tongue, I used Screamer Pink, and then I gave the teeth an edge highlight of Ultawan Gray, being careful to leave a bit of the dark brown between the flesh and the teeth and the tongue. For the armor, I gradually mixed in Fenrisian Gray to the original dark Eshin Gray to build up the bright highlights along the edges of the armor and on the kneecaps, with a bright Ultawan Gray. I used the same colors on the sword, but instead of building up edge highlights, I blended them into a streak of light going across the blade near the middle, and then also blending up again near the tip to give a reflective look. I recommend looking at reference art for this, specifically drawings or paintings of anime images that use the technique. Next, I used Corn Red on the gem on the center of the hilt of the sword, and on the centerpiece of the armor just below the breastplate, and finally on the top of the cross on the shield. And I gave them highlights with Evil Sun's Scarlet. I added the red because it completed the trinity of primary colors that are typically used for protagonists of video games. You can see Mario and Banjo-Kazooie as great examples of this. All of the gold on the hilt, the cross, and the edges of the armor was first coated with Steel Legion Drab, and then highlighted with Averland Sunset, and then given a few final bright dots of Flayed One flesh to get that bright gold reflection. I then highlighted the folds in the cloth with the original Teslas blue, and then finished them off by adding a bit of Ulthuan Grey mixed in, only on the upper folds near the shoulders. After some cleanup, it was finally time to work on the hair. For the hair, I started by working up to a 50-50 mix of Trollslayer Orange and Ereal Yellow, a fairly golden yellow tone. Then I finished it off by adding some edge highlights to the top ridge of the hair near the spikes near the front. This required quite a few coats to get clean because Ereal Yellow is a very thin yellow if applied directly. It tends to give off a greenish shade whenever it's not fully pigmented. Then I touched up the eyebrows and sideburns with that 50-50 mix. After a bit of touch-up on the shield and sword, the model was mostly complete. All that remains is the base. For all my Super Dungeon heroes, I start with a base coat of Eshin Grey, making sure to get in the cracks on the stones. Then I covered the surface of the stones with a 50-50 mix of Eshin Grey and Fenrisian Grey. I went a bit further here by penciling in a highlight around the edges of each stone with pure Fenrisian Grey to finish them off. I decided to finish the base rim with a very dark blue in the form of Cantor Blue. I know that many people have very strong feelings about painting all base rims black or very dark gray, but I'm okay with using a dark color that complements the colors I've prominently used on the model. To me, it's a ring that signifies the Player 1 character that you might particularly see in like action games like Gauntlet or Diablo that help you find your character on screen amidst all the chaos. After all the glamour shots, I coated the whole model with a matte varnish to give the paint a bit of extra protection when it's knocking around on the game board. In total, this paint job took me about 3 hours, but I could have stopped much earlier. I decided that I would try to find a way to challenge myself with each of the miniatures in this box. And with the Paladin here, the challenge was specifically non-metallic metal. I'm not super happy with how the shine on the sword turned out, but it was a great opportunity to practice a technique that I'm really just learning. Because this was my first time painting on video, there are a number of places where I accidentally pulled the model out of frame, and the zoom isn't great, so I guess you could say I learned more than one thing today. I definitely reviewed the footage and tried to correct this a bit more in the next few figures. Keep in mind that if you're a new painter coming to this video for some tips and tricks on how to paint some casual chibi minis, then you don't have to feel overwhelmed by all of the techniques and paints and colors and everything that I'm using here in this video. You can stop at any point along the process that you feel comfortable. As long as you're enjoying the painting process, that's all that matters. And if you like this video, then thank you so much for watching. And if you subscribe to the channel, then you can see me paint a whole bunch more of these Super Dungeon Explorer miniatures. And if you want to see me paint these miniatures live, you can check me out at Twitch at twitch.tv/microtunnelmatt. Thanks again so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.